Chapter 2. We've spent some time last week looking at, we got about halfway through, and looking at some of these pictures that are taken out of the Old Testament, these passages that are taken out of the Old Testament, and they begin to be applied to the church, to Christians. And one of the cool things that happens is that when you're welcomed into a family or into a group of people, their story sort of becomes your story. Like with history, for example. As an American, one of the things we tend to do is we tend to look back through history through a very particular lens, as somebody from the United States. And so you tend to view some of the most important conflicts in the world from the perspective of your people group. And so when you think about significant conflicts in the history of who you are, you might think of things like the Vietnam War. You might think of things like World War II. Lots of people think of that one. You might think of things like the Civil War. In fact, when you say the Civil War, as a U.S. citizen, there's like one particular war that you think of. The truth is, there have been a lot of civil wars. And so if you say the Civil War, generally speaking in history, outside of that very particular context, who knows which one you're talking about? As a U.S. citizen, probably, I don't know if anybody has ever heard of the Defenestration of Prague. Yes? No? Okay, defenestration, to throw somebody out of a window. Right? It's one of the coolest words. We have a word for that. Oh, to throw somebody out of a window is to defenestrate them. And so I tell my children sometime, you better behave or I'm going to defenestrate you. And at first they didn't know what it meant, so it sounded like really terrible. They're like, no, please. Like it just means to throw you out the window. So in the 17th century, there's a lot of religious wars going on, and this is a really significant event in the history of the Czech people. And there was a big fight, and one of the things that happened is an army stormed a political center, and they started throwing politicians out of the windows. And so it's the Defenestration of Prague. But that doesn't matter to you because it's not part of your story. What you see here is all of a sudden, now people who weren't part of God's story are being brought into it. And so now, all of a sudden, everything that has happened in the past suddenly begins to matter. If you were to move to Prague, it probably wouldn't be too long until you started to adapt their history, where things like that began to matter to you, where you began to root for the Czech soccer team or the Czech chess team, right? You'd start to root for those things. I'm a Cubs fan. I've always been a Cubs fan. Will always be a Cubs fan. If you don't like the Cubs, you're wrong, especially if you like the Cardinals. I moved to Texas with my family when we were young. I grew up and I had children who were born in Texas. Guess which baseball team they liked? The Astros. The Astros. Why? Because they didn't grow up in Brookfield. That's why. They didn't grow up in a suburb of Chicago. They grew up in Texas. And so they adopt the story of the people in Texas. We now, I've never been a Jew, as far as I know. I mean, it may have been a time where I forgot that I was Jewish, but as far as I know, I never have been. You go back, and the earliest person in our family that could possibly be Jewish is somebody in the 1850s who, in the U.S. Census, when asked his occupation, put Jew. I don't get it. My family's weird, and so I joke with my dad when I found that out. I was like, I don't know, maybe he was a carpenter, and that was like a weird joke, like Jesus was a carpenter. I don't know. I don't get it. Why would you put that in occupation? So that's like the one possibility that somebody in my recent family history is Jewish, is that guy in 1850, John Cuffle, in Ohio he lived, actually. Jokester. I've never been Jewish. Never been to the temple, never seen it, never been part of the priesthood. I've never lived in the land of promise, right? Never. Now all of a sudden, when you get here, this is being written to people who maybe have never been part of that either. They were not one of the 12 tribes who were chosen. They were not descendants of Jacob, of Israel. They were not at the temple services. They were not included in the promises. And now all of a sudden, now when Peter is writing to them, he says, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. You have moved, right? You've become part of this new group. And once you become part of this new group, their history is now yours. And that's what happens when you become a Christian. Everything that happens all throughout the text of Scripture, that's now your story. It's who you are now, right? Your background has changed so that you, like Paul, are able to talk about your father Abraham. As far as I don't know that Abraham is directly linked to my physical lineage in any way whatsoever. How can I call him my father Abraham? Well, because I've been adopted into this new family. And so now their story is my story. And so there's this changing that happens where we are now included in these things. Or to use Paul's example from the book of Romans, you're grafted in. You were a wild olive branch, but God has taken you and has grafted you in to the olive tree. And so now you're part of this family. And so now we are a chosen race. We, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his possession. And we talked about last week that the purpose of this is to proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness and into his light. We didn't used to be a people, but now we're God's people. We didn't have mercy, but now we have received mercy. So based on that, what needs to change? That's the next part. Beloved, I urge you then, as sojourners and exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Let's just look at that section first. So what does it mean to be a sojourner and an exile? Yeah, a wanderer without a home. Yeah, hopefully it's temporary. You don't want to be a sojourner your entire life. But yeah, the idea that right now you don't have a place. Yes. And we know, you're exactly right. We know that for us is temporary. We've got a place we're going. Yeah, you don't belong there. That's the exile. Right? Being an exile is not a good thing. That means that somebody has pushed you out or kicked you out. You're not part of the group. I don't know if you guys did this when you were in high school, but like in the lunchroom, people would get in little circles and stand around. Before school, people get in little circles. Have you ever tried to work your way into the circle if you're not part of it when it forms? It's almost like there's this defense mechanism that once the circle is completed, you don't let other people in. Right? I mean, it's weird. We have to make sure that when we're here as God's people, that we don't make circles. Let's make crescents or weird, obloid shapes that don't close so that people can always get in. Right? So that's sort of the idea, is that, yeah, you've been kicked out. You're not part of the group. And since you're not part of the group, you don't fit in with the world. And because you don't fit in with the people around you, you're not going to be welcomed. And because you're not going to be welcomed, there is going to be a desire to change who you are to fit back in. And so that's this idea of abstaining from the passions of the flesh. When you hear that phrase, you may think of like really bad things. Oh, he's telling us not to do really bad things. It's probably not what he's saying, because most people who are not Christians don't do really bad things. If you think about it, if you look at most people that you know, most non-religious people that you know, how many of them are like pirates and stuff? If you know an actual pirate, that'd be cool. I want to talk to you about it later. But I mean, very few people that I know I would describe as like just evil. They're like normal. And so when he says abstain from the passions of the flesh, there's this picture throughout all of Scripture where you have two things that are constantly at war with one another, and that is the flesh and the spirit. The woman of wisdom and the woman of folly in Proverbs, the people of God, the people of Satan throughout the text, the story in the text of Scripture. And so here this idea of the passions of the flesh, it's worldly desires. Right? Worldly desires. The desire to fit in, the desire to be famous, the desire to be known, the desire for lots of things. Right? All of these different desires. Really, perhaps one of the strongest pulls is the desire to belong. You want to belong with the people that you're around. You want to fit in your neighborhood, you want to fit in your school, you want to fit in at work, you want to fit in. And Peter, seems to be saying, don't give in to that desire to fit in with everybody else. Instead, sort of own the idea that you are a sojourner and an exile. Be different. Not for the sake of being different. I mean, don't go out of your way to be weird, but you're headed in a different direction, and that by necessity is going to create some gap. Be okay with that. Learn to not fit in, and be okay with that. How could that, and if you have other ideas about what that might mean, I mean, surely that would include being wicked. Don't be wicked. But how can that wage war against your soul? It's pretty strong language. What does that mean?
Think about Paul's discussion in Romans 7, knowing sin is internal struggles between the spirit and the flesh.
Yeah, Romans 7, with Paul's description of sort of the way he fights with himself. He knows what he ought to do and who he ought to be, but he finds himself continually drawn back to what he was.
I think, too, because the following verse talks about keep your conduct among Gentiles honorable, there's a responsibility that the Jews that are dispersed throughout have responsibility still in being a good example, even in spite of circumstances.
Yeah. Being honorable, you're exactly right. Being honorable means to do that which is seen as right. That's harder to do than it sounds. Saturday, is it Saturday? Friday. Favorite day of the year? No. April 15th, although now I think they moved it to like Monday when your taxes are due. Why even have a day if you're going to change it? So April 15th is the traditional tax day. One of the things that people do when they go to file their taxes, and I'm not telling you don't take exemptions, they're there. Take them if you want. But people sort of play with numbers, and they'll fill out their taxes, and then they'll go back through, and I know this because I had a friend who was an accountant, and he's had to dig many people out of holes that they have built themselves into. And he said, you can't fill out the forms and not be happy with the numbers, and then go back and change them until you're happy with the numbers. It doesn't work that way. And so what we have to do is we have to do what is right, and there are these rules as far as IRS forms are concerned, and when we fill those out, who knows? Who knows if you change the numbers a little bit? I mean, how many of you are called to release your tax returns publicly? Right? Don't run for office because they're going to ask you for that.
I think he's also saying here, Stephen, that this evil, this fleshly desires may not only affect your soul, but it affects others.
Yes.
They see you doing these things.
Yes.
And so it impacts a lot more than just you.
Yes. So if everybody sort of does that, right? Not everybody does, but it's a fairly common thing to play around with numbers on tax returns. If your neighbor who is an atheist gets caught doing it, people are going to go, oh, well, I mean, everybody does it. But if you, somebody who is known to be a Christian, does it, what are they going to say if you get in trouble with the IRS? Hypocrites. All these hypocrites, right? And so this is sort of the idea, is that I don't think that God expects you to be perfect, thankfully, right? We're justified through faith. By grace, we're justified through faith. But when we find ourselves interfacing and interacting with the world, it becomes even more important that you do what is right, because as somebody who is different, any wrongdoing becomes magnified in the eyes of everybody else. Right? The Romans don't like Judaism already. Right? The Greco-Roman world doesn't like Judaism already. This new Christianity thing is sort of seen as a weird sect of Judaism. And so when it comes along, they already don't like them. And if they start doing things that give them an excuse to punish them, well, now I get to do to you legally what I've already wanted to do to you all along, which is punish you for being different. And so it's one of those weird things where because you are different, any wrongdoing gets magnified by the world around you. I don't know why that happens. I just know that it does. In my personal experience, if somebody said something that wasn't true and they weren't, known to be a religious person, it's like, well, everybody tells a little white lie every once in a while. But if somebody who was religious said something that wasn't true, watch out, because the universe just stopped. So here's this call. Because you are a sojourner and an exile, keep your conduct honorable. People are going to say bad things about you. He doesn't say so that if they speak against you as evildoers. He says so that when. Interesting thing about Christians. The Romans thought they ate children. I don't know why. That's like one of the things that you always say about people who are weird. No, you can't go over to their house. I hear they eat babies. I don't know why we do that. You can trace this throughout history. Every time there's like an odd group in a country, in a group of people, one of the things that gets said about them is that they eat children. I don't know why. And so when the Romans, they have these Christians who come along, one of the things that they say about the Christians is that not only do they eat flesh and drink blood, where did they get that idea? From Jesus. Yeah, I mean, he says those things exactly, right? From the Lord's Supper. And not only, and now if you were to hear that, if you were to walk into a conversation halfway and you hear somebody say, you have to eat my skin and drink my blood, you're going to back out of that conversation pretty quickly, right? Because that's a weird place to come in. So, but that's what the Romans hear. They hear that these people get together in private parties, they drink blood and they eat flesh, and they probably eat kids too. Right? And so that's the kind of thing in the first century that is being said about Christians. So Peter doesn't say, if they're going to say bad things about you, he says when they say bad things about you. They're children eating cannibals. That's what those Christians are. Now, how attractive does that make Christianity? So how are you going to win people to Christ if the first thing they've ever heard about you is that you're a cannibal and you eat babies? You're going to have to be a pretty special person. And so that's sort of the idea here is you have to keep your conduct among the Gentiles because they're going to say bad things about you. There's going to be rumors. There's going to be false accusations. There's going to be all sorts of things. And so what you have to do is you have to live in such a way that they see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. You have to live differently. And the way that you live differently is living like Jesus. All people will know that you are my disciples by the way that you love one another. Yeah, exactly. So here's kind of the idea. This is how you win people over. They're going to say bad things about you, and when they revile you, you don't revile them in return. When they hit you, you don't hit them back. When they take things from you, you give generously to them instead. And so there's this different way of living in which you are going to show the world that you're not like the world, and that there actually is something to this Christianity thing. They're going to say bad things about you, so you do good things to them instead, and they will see that and glorify God. There's a Roman emperor who's very anti-Christian. Very anti-Christian. It was in the 3rd century. 3rd century, I think. And he lamented, right, he hated Christians, and he lamented the fact that Christians were so kind to people. Like, not only do they take care of their own sick and poor, but they take care of ours also. Why can't our people be more like those people that we hate. That's pretty much like the summary of his view on Christianity, is how come the Romans can't be more like these Christians that we don't like? There's a reason why Christianity grew. It's because people did what was good in the face of what was evil, and they didn't become like the world. They didn't revile, they didn't hurt, they didn't hate. They served, they loved, and they were generous. And that causes people, even if they don't want to have to give God glory. That's powerful. So our testimony to the world is going to be in who we are as God's people. So from this point, he's going to start talking about, well, how do you do that? Right, that's sort of like the big picture idea. How do you do that? All right, let's read verses 13 through 17, and then we can discuss those. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Around the time when this is written, it could have been written about Nero. He may be the emperor at this time. Nero, interestingly, started off as like a pretty normal person, like an okay guy, and he seems to slowly have gone insane. One of the reasons we think that might have happened is Roman nobility had a habit of lining their drinking cups with lead because it made the wine taste good. And slowly over time, you're poisoning yourself and deteriorating your mental health. And so when you look at Nero's early life, he liked poetry and he liked music, and he was very generous when it came to trials. One of the reasons perhaps that Paul appeals to Caesar is because at that time in history, Nero was known for being very gracious to prisoners. He often extended clemency, especially if it was something that he didn't care about. He would rather just let you go and not deal with it. Toward the end of his life, he becomes very wicked and a completely different person. This would be like closer to that point where Nero is doing unspeakable things to people. And here, he doesn't say, fight the emperor. Instead, he says, honor the emperor. Submit, be subject to every institution, whether the emperor or governors or whomever. So when you hear that, verses 13 through 17, what are some of the ideas that you have, and what are some ways that this applies to us even today? Yeah. We have to be willing to let the government govern and to submit to it, to be subject to it. Yeah, Trey?
Along that, I mean, it seems like the focus here, well, the thing that he says is that by doing good. And so, I guess that means that's the focus for us in those moments. The focus isn't what is the government doing, oh, the government is awful, or the government is great, it's how I want it. But the focus for us is always the same no matter what that situation is, no matter who the emperor is,
I like that. No matter who's in charge, your job is to do good. Your job is to be who you are as these sojourners and exiles.
It's interesting too that puts these people on offense instead of on the defense. In spite of them being naturally going to a defensive mode if they're under persecution. So from that perspective, there's always going to be the things against you, especially if you're a sojourner acting differently, being a godly individual. So you ignore that piece of it, and as Trey said, know your mission and keep moving forward from an offensive perspective.
Yeah. And what allows us to do that, right? It comes back again to this idea of this isn't your home. Right? The government of the United States, yeah, you live here right now, but you're a sojourner. You're in exile. It's not really your government. Right? It is the power over the place where you happen to be staying right now. But your citizenship is in heaven. Your government is a monarchy with the Lord Jesus as king. That is your government. And there's no complaints with that one. Right? And so while I'm just like passing through, I'm gonna do whatever I have to do. Right? I remember one time I was traveling with my dad, and he had a firearm. And we would stop at every state, and he would have to do different things with the gun. Like one of the weird ones at the time was Missouri, where you had to take the gun, and the gun could be in the case, one case, and it had to be in the trunk, and any ammunition that you had to be in a totally separate case. So you couldn't have ammunition in the case with your weapon, right? It had to be moved. And so I remember him doing these things where he would go to state lines, and it was weird. But that's sort of the idea. We didn't live in Missouri, but when we traveled through Missouri, we had to obey the laws of that place. I don't live here. As great and as amazing as this place is, this is not my country. And I don't mean that in some Marxist, neo-revolutionary way. That's not at all what I mean. What I mean is, I don't live here. I just happen to be staying here temporarily. My country is that heavenly place that Abraham was looking for, that Isaac and Jacob were looking for, that all of the patriarchs were searching for. That's my home. That's where I'm going. And so whatever happens here, I'm just going to put the stuff in the trunk, separate the bags, and continue driving. And do the good that I can while I'm passing through. And that's exactly the idea. Is your job is not to fix the government. Right? That's not what Christianity is here to do. It's not going to happen. Our job is to honor God by doing good. And when we do that, the world around us will see, and some people in that world will be converted. And now there's more people on us with our road trip. And road trips are always fun with more friends. And so we're trying to get as many people to come with us on the way home as we possibly can. And that's sort of the idea at the end, is this idea of glorifying God. Or back at verse 12, sorry, the end of that.
Let me ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that you shouldn't put any effort into making things better?
That's a good question. So the question is, does that mean you shouldn't put any effort into making things better? If you look at the history of our country, and I really don't want to get off into that too much, in the past 50 years, the more religious people in our country have tried to get things legislated. The issue with legislating is if I make rules that govern your conduct, have I necessarily converted you? No. So should we try to make things better? I think the resounding answer to that is a yes. Absolutely we should. The point where we might get into a longer discussion is how does one go about making things better? I think one answer, and it's just one, but I think one answer that we all could agree on is that you make things better by converting people to Christ. The more Christians there are in any place, the better that place will be. The more Christians there were in ancient Rome, the better ancient Rome became. The more Christians that there are in Middle Tennessee, the better this place is going to be. And so when I think about where I'm putting my effort, that I think is in my mind, the best way to change things. You change a culture by changing the people, and you change people by converting them to Christ. And as people become Christians, other things will change. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't vote. You have the right to vote. It doesn't mean that you can't run for public office. I don't know why you would want to put yourself through such a terrible ordeal, but it doesn't mean you can't do those things. It just means that the end goal is not to get a particular legislation passed and force people to behave. The goal is to have people converted to Jesus so that they will want to behave. They will want to join you in doing these good works and going home. Does that make sense? Yes? If you try and take the government and make the government Christian, that word syncretism, that's exactly what that is. That's what happens in the 4th century when, I think it's 393. Was it Theodosius? It doesn't matter who did it, right? One of the Roman emperors, at the end of the 4th century, declared that the only religion in the Roman Empire is Christianity. And what he did is he sort of took the Roman government and he sort of wove Christianity in to the Roman government, and now you have this thing that historians would call syncretism, right? Political philosophers, syncretism. It is the taking together of two things and blending them in such a way that neither is really what it's supposed to be anymore, where you sort of make your religion about your politics, or your politics about your religion, right? That's syncretism. That's not Christianity. And so what we have to do, and when I say we, me, right, I have to be very careful that I don't make my religion about politics. Right? That is a huge temptation in our country. One of the biggest churches in the area where I grew up is the First Baptist Church in Dallas, and not saying anything bad about the people who happen to attend there. Maybe. Around 4th of July, they have it's just a giant auditorium. And I remember watching it on television as a kid. And they have parades with people from all the different branches of service. They have American flags. They have fireworks inside a building. I don't know how the fire marshal allows that, but it's like a giant 4th of July parade at church. And I remember thinking as a little kid, wow, this is so cool. God bless the USA, which is not a bad thing to say, right? I mean, that's sort of the idea in this passage, that whatever nation you happen to be part of, you should want good things for it, like Israel and Babylon. Pray for the nation where you are. But growing up and looking back, I remember at one of the celebrations, the speaker was Oliver North, which you may or may not be aware with. And I went back and watched the recording of that service. He didn't talk about the gospel of Jesus once. Once. He talked an awful lot about the United States. He talked about the Constitution. He talked about all sorts of things like that. He didn't talk about the gospel of Jesus once. That's syncretism. That's bad. Wanting good things for the country where you live, that's Israel in Babylon. That's not a bad thing. Right? Wanting the president to be healthy, to make good decisions, that's good. But again, my religion isn't about the place where I live. It's about me living in the place where I happen to be until I get to go home. And so that's sort of the way that I would briefly answer that. Yes?
In elementary schools, like once a month, once a year, they give out good citizen awards. The teacher or the students pick who in the classroom is a good citizen. As we get older, obviously, we've been handing out pieces of paper to each other for that. But I've just been sitting here thinking, when people see us, that's what they should see.
Yes.
If we were going to hand out adult good citizen awards, hopefully as Christians we would be running for that.
Yes. And every once in a while in history, you see somebody who sort of gets that idea, like rulers in the ancient world. They're like, wait a minute, we want more of these Christian people. They obey, right? They make really good citizens because they follow the rules, right? And so that's exactly right, is you want to be known as someone who is a good person. Because at some point, most people are going to go through a really bad time in their life, and they're going to need somebody to sort of help point them in a good direction, and you want to be the person they think of. You want to be the person when they say, wow, who reacts well when bad things happen? Who sort of knows what direction their life ought to be going? Even if it doesn't always seem to be going that way, at least they know where they're headed. Who does what is right? Who is kind and loving and generous and merciful? You want them to think of you. You want the people that you know to think of you. That's a wonderful way to think of that. I've never thought of that before. Thank you for that picture.
This version that I use here, kind of interesting statement. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of the foolish men.
Yes.
So there's something you can do.
Yes. Yeah, as you live as a believer, right, we tend to vilify and things that we don't know or that we are unfamiliar with. And when Christianity is being introduced to new places, one of the early Roman writers in early Christianity, he would call it that most evil of superstitions. That's the way he described Christianity, that most evil of superstitions. Well, how do you show people that it's not an evil superstition? I mean, that's an ignorant statement. He just didn't know what Christianity was. And so our job as believers, as we interact with people, increasingly in our country, who really don't know what Christianity is anymore, how do you show them what it is? How do you show them who Jesus is? How do you show them what following Jesus is about? Well, this. And you will put to silence their ignorance. Because if you were just to leave the United States and look at religion in America, what would you think religion was about? That's a hard thing to do, to sort of excise yourself from your place, imagine you're somewhere else looking in. If you just think about American religion in general, what is it about? Politics is a big one. Yep. It's very social. Yep. Money. Yeah, if you go to another country and you watch an American preacher, chances are you're going to watch somebody like Joel Osteen, who yeah, you're going to watch someone like him. You're going to watch, what was that?
Go ahead and say it.
I've seen a lot of his sermons. I don't know that I've ever, heard him talk about Jesus. Or you're going to get a prosperity preacher. If you're just faithful, God will give you tons of money. He will give you everything that you desire. Right? Now, if you leave the United States, that's sort of what you're going to see. Now, is that a universal representation of religion in our country? No. So our culture then is increasingly viewing religion in that way. People who are from outside of our country view religion in that way, hyper-political, hyper-monetary, and your job, our job, is to show people that that's not what Christianity is. And when we talk about those things, right, the point is never to single out a person and really make fun of them. The point, even with somebody like Joel Osteen, despite the fact that you have him teaching these things that are leading people away from God, not to him necessarily, or to, anyway, to want good things for him, to pray for him, to desire that good things happen. And that's sort of what we have to be focused on always, is in everything we can, praying for people that we see things not headed the right way, loving them, doing what we can, being careful to not speak ill. He says, honor the emperor. Could you have found bad things to say about Nero in the first century? Not hard, right? Not hard at all. So what are you supposed to do? Honor the emperor. And not just the emperor, but look at the beginning of verse 17, honor everyone. Honor everyone. That's hard. This idea of speaking well of people, finding ways to show goodness to people, it's hard. He's going to go on, and he's going to leave that. So that's sort of like a big, how do you fit into a nation or a place type thing, a province. And he's going to get into then some more personal examples. Servants or slaves, your translation may say slaves, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. That's different. That's different. One of the greatest fears in ancient Rome is slave rebellion. It's not quite as bad as Sparta, where you have 10 slaves to every Spartan, but it's pretty close. Like some estimates are like 40%, 45% of the population in Rome is slave. It's even greater if you start including like servants, not necessarily like formally slaves. Could you imagine living in a place where about half of the population was a slave? Wouldn't you be in constant fear that they would rise up and seek out their freedom? So here what he's saying is, if you're a slave, your job is not to fight your master, but your job is to fight your master by being loving and kind and merciful and showing them Christ, who came not to be served, but to serve. That's your job. Your job is not to seek out. And Paul will say, if you can get your freedom, great, get it, right? And so this isn't God, blessing slavery. He's saying, if this happens to be the place where you find yourself, this is how you behave. And it is counter-cultural. It is the opposite of what I would do if I was a slave and I had a master. I would fight for my freedom. I would want to get away. And he says, hang on. If you can do it legally, yes. But if you can't, then you have to be subject. And that's where we'll leave it, this idea of subjection. And we're going to talk about next time, we'll talk about this idea. What does it mean to be subject? And then we're going to continue through that section. All right, so thank you for your comments. This is sort of the heart and soul of where Peter is going. Thank you very much.